In our last video, we discussed evolution and the origin of human life according to the explanation that contemporary science has attempted to provide, based on the best observational evidence and the theory that that evidence supports. On your screen now you see Homo erectus on the far left. Notice the mouth getting smaller, the canines smaller, the brow ridge still large, the brain bigger halfway between a chimpanzee and a human, but not yet human size. Likely somewhere around here is when people would have discovered fire. Neanderthal, both Homo erectus and Neanderthals, tool users and makers. Neanderthal still a prominent brow ridge, an even bigger brain case than Homo sapiens have. And this here is a scientific reconstruction of what the earliest humans would have looked like. This is what's referred to as Homo sapiens adultu. You'll notice that he has African features because he likely evolved in Africa. That is not to say that black people, because they share traits with the earliest humans, are therefore primitive. And let me be clear about that. What that means is that populations that remained in Africa remained subject to the same evolutionary pressures and therefore retained those features. No one human population is any more primitive than any other in evolutionary terms. All human populations have exactly the same ability to use language, to transmit culture, to create tools and affect their environment, to speak and be rational. That's likely what makes humans human, is their ability to use language. And every single human population has exactly the same capacity to use language. Therefore, no human population is any more primitive than any other. In the broadest sense, it's not even true that humans are more evolved than any other species, chimpanzee or sea slug. In fact, every organism which is alive today is a winner of the evolutionary race. And so we're all equally well evolved as each other. Now, as human populations spread and migrated out of Africa, those that went east and retained in a lower latitude retained darker features, and maybe had different hair through perhaps genetic drift. Those that went more north and east had slightly lighter skin tones, perhaps to help with vitamin D absorption in higher latitudes, and gained the characteristic Asian eye shape that may have been beneficial in combating snow blindness in especially cold regions. This here is Sitting Bull. You might notice there is a similarity in features between Sitting Bull and this indigenous inhabitant of Siberia. The reason why is that Sitting Bull's ancestors likely crossed over the Bering Land Bridge from Eurasia, and thus is descended from his ancestors, so that there's an evolutionary relationship between Native Americans and indigenous Asians because of that migratory pattern and evolutionary divergence. Now, there is an evolutionary divergence which goes towards explaining why the different races of humans exist. However, we are clearly and absolutely still one and only one species. The reason why we can say that is that every human population is equally able to interbreed with every other human population on Earth. That is the definition of a species, even with our differences. Those populations that went north gained lighter features, likely also to help with sunlight absorption. And those that went in middle latitudes and have mixed ancestries with native populations gained intermediate features. From here, we begin our discussion of ancient religions and cultures. We've already identified that there's a relationship between philosophy and religion. When I was studying in undergrad and graduate school, my department was the Department of Philosophy and Religion Studies. Different religions have a very significant influence on different philosophies. Each religion has its own philosophy and informs its own philosophy. Much of Western philosophy is incredibly strongly influenced by Judeo-Christianity. But there's Buddhist philosophy, Confucian philosophy, Shinto philosophy, Islamic philosophy, pagan philosophies, Native American philosophies, indigenous African philosophies, and indigenous Australian philosophies. There's another usage of the word philosophy that we haven't made use of yet. For example, when a person asks, "What is your philosophy?" they mean, what are the principles you live your life by? And each culture and their attendant religions have their own principles to inform how one should live a life and what makes for a good life. So that in dealing with world religions, we are dealing with the philosophical systems of the people of planet Earth. Let's jump in. The word indigenous means native to an area. You'll want to make special note of that. what you'll see that I've brought up is that around the world, in many different cultures, a similar story often recurs. That of a great global worldwide flood. Our first reading, the Epic of Gilgamesh, contains a story of a flood from around 2000 to 2500 years BC. In this context, BCE means before the Common Era, and CE replaces AD as the Common Era. What you'll notice is that this Persian or Babylonian story of a flood, according to the best scholarship, archaeological, and historical evidence available, appears to be between 400 and 1300 years older than the story of the flood first recorded in what Christians call the Old Testament and what Jewish people call the Torah or the Tanakh, Noah's flood. This should arouse curiosity. What is the meaning or significance of different cultures having the same story? Is it evidence that a worldwide flood really happened? Is it a telephone game where one culture starts the story and others pick it up and change some of the words? Is it a case of convergent evolution? Convergent evolution happens when different organisms independently evolve similar features, such as how dragonflies and hummingbirds have both solved the challenge of attaining flight. Did the Persians over here, the Hindus, and the ancient Jews all come up with the same story independently? Or is this a telephone game where the story is passed from culture to culture to culture, changing as it goes? Perhaps our archaeology and scholarship is just wrong and confused, and we just haven't found old enough evidence. Or perhaps this is a trick from the devil. However, there has been significant philosophical discussion as to whether or not God allows the devil to deceive us within later Renaissance Christian philosophy that we'll be discussing later this semester. The fact of the matter is this, though. There is absolutely no archaeological or geological evidence of a global worldwide flood ever having occurred. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but we have no evidence of it happening. And that strongly makes sense. The story of a great flood such as Noah's is the story of God drowning every man, woman, and child, as well as every animal on earth, save one family. Even though this is very often thought to be a children's story, upon as objective investigation as we are possible, it borders on the horrific. We will have opportunity to discuss how to make sense of a perfect God and an imperfect creation. Perhaps the two can go together. Perhaps not. Philosophy has attempted to deal with that question in different ways throughout the centuries that separate us and the origin of this story or narrative. We will investigate not only whether that paradox can be overcome, but also whether a loving or just God could also be so destructive. While we are comfortable with this idea because it's familiar, upon closer inspection, it likely should give us pause for consideration. How do we square a perfect God and a flawed creation? Perhaps free will solve this problem, as some philosophers have argued. Or, more darkly, as some of the ancient Greek philosophers will discuss, have suggested, perhaps the gods are not even good. For a philosopher will discuss, after discussing Plato, perhaps God is, instead of good, as many people think, evil. That idea, for most of the history of the Western world, is a death sentence. It's a thought crime. It's not allowed. But philosophy has dared to think dangerously, and to fully investigate the claims, we'll have to investigate both sides of an unpleasant and uncomfortable disjunctive syllogism, the either-or statement. Or at the very least, wrestle to make sense of troubling paradoxes that form the foundation of a variety of religious beliefs. Lastly, we'll attempt to make sense of a couple of difficult questions. First off, why do the different religions exist at all? Is it the case that God made men and men rebelled? Or is it the case that different men made different gods, each in their own image? One of the two is likely true. which is more likely or more persuasive will be a challenge to uncover. Also, we'll want to know, are these stories literal or mythological? To take a text that people believe to be true in our society and to suggest that it is mythology is basically heresy. It's heretical. People who suggest these ideas are heretics. Heretics are common in philosophy. For people like Socrates and Giordano Bruno, nearly Galileo, suggesting the Bible is not factually and scientifically accurate means execution. And we have a number of intellectual and philosophical martyrs to learn about. In the past 150 years or so, such heresies are significantly more openly accepted, or at least safer to investigate. And so, in the spirit of heretical philosophy, we will investigate these deeply challenging issues. Lastly, there's a common idea in our society that the story of the Great Flood, involving Noah, or perhaps some other character, Manu for the Hindus, Gilgamesh for the ancient Persians, grandfather spirit for the ancient Delaware Indians. It's supposed that this flood explains why dinosaurs no longer walk among us. But if logic is to be our guide, as it is for all philosophical inquiry, there are some significant logical flaws with this proposed argument. Namely, there were a number of sea-dwelling dinosaurs. Such as Ichthyosaurus and Plesiosaurus. If the Great Flood is to explain why they no longer exist, then why would whales and dolphins and octopuses and giant squids still exist? In fact, there might be a very good reason why ancient peoples would have thought that the entire world had flooded. For example, if you were to go to the top of a mountain range, like the Himalayas, or the Rocky Mountains, or the Sandia Mountains in New Mexico, what you are likely to see there are fossilized sea creatures, fish, and cephalopods at the top of a mountain. Do you know how we explain that phenomenon today? Science provides us the naturalistic explanation of tectonic shifts, geological processes by which ancient sea floors over time and the movements of tectonic plates, rise up and become mountain ranges. So that what was once at the bottom of the sea is now on the top of a mountain. If an ancient person might have gone to the top of a nearby mountain, they might have seen sea creature fossils there and understandably reasoned that even the mountaintops must once have been covered with water. But our explanation through naturalistic science today offers something other than the supernatural explanation that simply God did it, that they might have been able to offer then. As a preview of what we'll be doing before we discuss ancient Greek philosophy, we'll look first at the Epic of Gilgamesh, considered to be the oldest book ever written. Then look at native cultures and their philosophies, ancient Egyptian ideas to understand the origin of the idea of the soul and the afterlife, the Code of Hammurabi to understand legal systems and to think through the ethics and politics of the death penalty for which it was known. The Hindu Vedas to understand polytheism, or a system of religion with multiple gods or deities, which still exists and is practiced by nearly 1 billion people today. The story of Abraham from the Torah, what Christians call the Old Testament, in order to understand Christianity and both Judaism and Christianity's influence on Western philosophy for the eons that follow. And a Persian monotheistic religion that literally evolves from earlier Babylonian polytheistic religion called Zoroastrianism, which has significant similarities with Christianity, specifically a heaven and a hell, reward and punishment, and an afterlife. And we'll also turn our eyes towards the Eastern or Oriental world, thinking through Confucian and Taoist philosophy to see what benefit we can garner there, and to look at Buddhism and its philosophy as a counterpoint to more traditional and standard Western philosophy, which often largely ignores Eastern philosophy and the religion it springs from, though I would argue that ignorance is inappropriate and unhelpful. We'll pick up in the next video dealing with native or indigenous beliefs around the world, their similarities, and what benefit we can gain from them intellectually as well as philosophically.